Okay, now we're going to put it all together. We're going to make a web page and then connect it to our database with PHP, and then use some SQL statements to add and remove our information to our database. And then we'll create another web page that can pull information to our database. So this is the resource I'm using, w3schools.com. W3Schools, the W3C consortium is really sort of the organizing body of the web. So this is the latest and greatest tutorials right here. A great place if you want to learn HTML and CSS, which are far easier than programming. So to put this all into perspective as to how this works, we have an HTML page, and that is the way it looks is handled by CSS. So CSS is cascading style sheets. Those are all the style. That's what affects the way your web page looks. So that's not really programming, that's the design. From there, when you access a web page and you want to do something cool with it, you have to use PHP, which runs off the server. So PHP provides a two-way street from the server, the web server that is, to our web page. We get information from there and back. Just like when we request an HTML page from a server, it might go directly there and back. But the PHP then uses mySQL to access a database. And that database can either reside on our web server, or it can be on its own database server. So either way, these can be one and the same. So that's kind of a little overview of how we're putting all this together. Okay, so for our web page, we're making a very simple web page, and I just went into HTML. I'm here on the HTML tutorial, and scroll down. There's probably something on forms, form types, HTML input types. So we're going to have a little one that looks like this. Let me scroll down a little farther because we're going to have a button on ours. That's what ours will look like. We'll have an input for like first name and last name. We'll probably set this up to be movie since we need to use the two fields in our database. So maybe you can set it up to be movie, title, and the year it was made. And then we'll have a submit button. What's great about this web page is that you can has a built-in editor, and you can just steal the code right out of here. So one thing to note, later on we'll be changing right in here to whatever name of your PHP page that you create is. So when we get our PHP created, we'll have to change that name, or you can just make it called action page. So the way it works, this is what a typical HTML tag is like. Indicates to the web browser that this is going to be HTML, and when you save your web page, save it as .html. Just like when we save our PHP one, we do .php. So we'll have like first name, this creates a line break. This is code that sets up the input box. It's going to be text, as you can see, and the name and value. The value means we're pre-populating the field, so you can leave that blank. But this part is going to be very crucial. When we start passing information over to PHP, it's going to want to know the name of that field. So that's how we'll be pulling our populating our variable with information, is with that first name and last name. So these will be like title and year. Notice we might have that here, but that's just for display purposes. And then the button's going to be just called a submit button. So that's the first part of that. So copy this, paste it in, and put it in your www file so that we can have that as a working web page. Next, we're going to go ahead and set up a PHP page. It's going to connect to our MySQL database. So I'm here under the PHP tutorials. Scrolling down, I'm way down here under databases. So we're going to connect to a database. And there's several ways of doing it, but we're going to use this mySQLi. So you'll be able to copy this right out of here and save it as a PHP file. And there's a few things to note. Our server name, that'll probably be localhost. Our username, that'll be whatever username you're using. You might have set it up as root and Tor as your password. This will allow us to have access to the database since it's password protected. Otherwise, that would be terrible security. So you may have used root and Tor, or you may have used your what you log onto your Linux machine with, and then that password. So if you have some issues with that, go back and change your passwords. So remember, when you save this PHP file, also save it as the name of whatever file you used in the last HTML page. Then we're going to create our connection. So think of this as like a variable, or $ connection. That's a variable name. It could be like $X. So instead of like integer x equals 0, this database is just, or this variable is a connection to the database, and it's equal to this connection, which is a connection to this server with the username and password we specified up above. Then we have a simple if statement. So if there's an error in our connection, we're going to have it, what we're trying to do, end or die. Otherwise, we're going to connect successfully. So get that put together, and then see if you can get this connection message. Remember, this has to be run through localhost up top. If you just double click on the PHP file, it doesn't run it through a server, and it has to be run through a server to work. So what you'd have to do is use your file or just run this on the web page. So localhost/whatever.php up top, and you should get this connection set up. Once we have the connection set up, then we'll use SQL to populate data. So we'll still add more to this. The next step, and I'm bumping down a little bit to this one, mySQL insert data. So we've connected. As you see, this looks familiar to the last PHP page we did, so we'll be updating that. We have our server name, username and password, and now we're going to have something to establish our database connection. So you probably have a database in there that we're going to want to use, like movies_db1, something like that. So that's what we would probably create in there. So then we're going to add that to our connection. So not only are we connecting to our server or database, we're connecting to our server and then the database with inside it. So this if statement should look familiar. If we don't connect, we'll have a connection message pop up. But if we do connect, we're going to then use some SQL. So we're concatenating our SQL statement into one variable, and we're going to do this. We're going to insert into, we'll have to change this to like movies. So we insert into the correct table, or whatever your table name is. Something like title and year. So we'll probably only need 2 parameters inside our parentheses, and then put in any values you want, such as the title might be, what's the latest movies that's out? Raiders of the Lost Ark Part 9, and then you might put the year in there, 2020, something like that. Then we'll have an if statement here. So if all this works, it'll say, hey, we did it. If not, it'll generate an error, and then we close our database connection. So then you can refresh you'll save this, replace your PHP file that you just used, and in your www folder, and then go up top and test it by doing localhost/whatever file name.php this is, and you should see if it works. And then our final step will be to be able to pull from that database and populate a web page. So that's going to be a separate PHP file. So on this one, I scroll down, we're going to select a little data. So what this is going to end up doing is this will be a separate file, as I said. It's going to it's going to be able to connect to our server, pull information or query information from our database, and then populate it. So one thing you may want to do is run your previous HTML form and add a few movies into it. So originally what's going to happen is we might want to then connect or modify our PHP page. And that's going to be the challenge for you. No, excuse me, your HTML page. Where see if you can get that HTML page and use that form to populate your database with a number of movies and titles. So that way you can use that HTML form page a number of times to put maybe 5 movies in your database, so that rather than instituting just whatever we hardwired in here, it'll use the variables from that web page. First name, last name. We might have changed that to movie and title. So that's how we'll get that using our database populated with a few things. Then once we have it, we're going to read that data. So there's lots we can do with this. We'll probably just pull everything from our database. So we have our connection up top. This is a new PHP page. These are all of our username, password, and things. Just that should look familiar. We're going to connect to our database. If we don't connect properly, we'll get an error. If not, we have a SQL statement here, which is a query. You might select star from our database. And then that result is going to be stored in this result variable. So our SQL query, which we defined on the line above, is going to be all stored in here. And this is going to go through and that's echo. That's sort of like the system.out print line. So what it's going to do, pretty much while there's still rows of data in the database, it's going to keep going through and fetch all that information, store it in result, like put that in a row for display. And then if the database is empty, it will say there's nothing there. So ideally, when all is said and done, you should be able to type on your HTML page, type in the name of a movie, hit submit. That will populate your database with that movie name. And then you'll run the next PHP page. You might this one, you'll probably have to type that in directly, localhost / whatever the name of this one is. And that should show you all the data in your database. So every time you add a new movie, it should then appear. And that is cool stuff.